How does a woman end up pregnant while serving time in a prison with no male inmates, no conjugal visits, no contact allowed, no loopholes? And yet, that's exactly what happened at South Ridge Correctional Facility. One morning, during a routine health check, a 30-year-old inmate tested positive for pregnancy. She had only 4 weeks left on her 5-year sentence. She wasn't supposed to see any man. She wasn't even allowed to hug a female visitor. So, how did this happen? The prison went into full-blown panic. Lockdown was initiated. Internal Affairs launched an investigation. Every hallway camera was pulled. Every male staff member was interrogated. And when the truth finally came out, it led to one of the biggest scandals the facility had ever seen. The name at the center of it all, Dean Holloway, a correctional officer, trusted, respected, quiet, the kind of man no one would suspect. He was supposed to protect the system. He was supposed to enforce the rules. Instead, he broke the most sacred one of all. He fell in love with an inmate. And now, both of them were about to face consequences neither had ever imagined. 3 months before she was supposed to walk down the aisle in a white dress, Natalie Quinn walked into a courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. She was 30 years old, a former makeup artist in Lexington, Kentucky, with no criminal record and no history of violence. But none of that mattered now. The prosecution called her dangerous, unstable, and vengeful. The judge looked at her like a ticking time bomb. The media didn't care about her side of the story, and neither, it seemed, did anyone else. Just 6 weeks earlier, Natalie was engaged to Ryan Morgan, a handsome, successful auto body shop owner she'd dated for almost 4 years. He was charming in public and soft-spoken in private. He sent her flowers every Friday. He called her his forever girl. They had even bought a house together, a little 2-bedroom place with white shutters and a porch swing she picked out herself. But behind the scenes, something darker was brewing. Natalie's best friend, Courtney, had been growing strangely distant. The same Courtney who stood by her side through college, heartbreaks, and late-night breakdowns. The same Courtney who was supposed to be her maid of honor. At first, Natalie thought it was stress or maybe just nerves about the wedding. Until one afternoon, Natalie came home early from a bridal dress fitting and found Ryan's truck in the driveway, even though he was supposed to be at work. She walked through the door quietly, instinctively, like she already knew. The bedroom door was half closed. She didn't knock. What she saw didn't need explanation. Courtney, Ryan, her bed, her wedding dress hanging in the closet just feet away. Natalie didn't scream. She didn't cry. She turned around, walked out the front door, drove around aimlessly for hours. Something inside her detached, like reality split. The next night, she returned to Ryan's apartment. She waited in the hallway until he got home from work. She didn't have a gun. She didn't plan to kill him. But when he smirked at her, that smug, guilty face, something snapped. She picked up a glass bottle from the counter and smashed it across his face. Then again, and again. He fell to the floor, bleeding from his scalp and hands, trying to shield himself. She stopped only when the neighbors came running. By then, there was blood everywhere. Ryan survived barely with over 30 stitches to his face and arms. Natalie was arrested at the scene, still crying, her hands trembling. She didn't resist. She didn't even speak. In court, her lawyer tried to argue temporary emotional insanity, the betrayal, the humiliation, the sheer shock of it all. But the jury didn't buy it. Maybe because she didn't cry on the stand. Maybe because she looked too calm. Maybe because Ryan showed up with a neck brace and a black eye, playing the victim role too well. Whatever the reason, they convicted her of aggravated assault, 2nd degree. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison with no chance of parole before year 4. Natalie didn't cry when they read the verdict. She just closed her eyes. She was transferred to South Ridge Correctional Facility 2 weeks later, a mid-level women's prison built between a pair of low Kentucky hills. It was isolated, quiet, and cold. Not the kind of place you'd expect sympathy. On her first day, Natalie didn't say a word. She was assigned to Block G, Cell 18, a unit for nonviolent offenders with no gang affiliations. Her bunkmate was a woman named Denise, who had been inside for check fraud and barely looked up from her Bible when Natalie walked in. The adjustment was brutal. Natalie didn't eat for 2 days. She cried quietly at night. She jumped at every loud noise. The sounds of steel doors slamming, guards yelling down corridors, buzzers blaring, they became a constant assault on her nerves. She barely slept. She refused to talk to anyone, not the inmates, not the staff, not even the prison therapist. Every night, her stomach curled in on itself. She would wake up shaking, gasping for air, heart pounding. Some nights, she imagined Ryan's face bloodied, swollen, blinking up at her, and she didn't know whether she felt guilt or satisfaction. The prison staff took notice. They marked her as mentally fragile, potential suicide risk, emotionally unstable, but they didn't do much beyond documenting it. One counselor suggested medication. Natalie refused. Another suggested isolation, but someone vetoed it. That someone was Officer Dean Holloway. Dean had worked at South Ridge for almost 12 years. He had seen hundreds of inmates come and go. Some were loud and defiant, others manipulative, but Natalie was different. She didn't posture. She didn't threaten. She just collapsed inward. Quiet suffering, heavy silence, the kind of pain that doesn't make noise. Dean was never the kind of officer who barked orders or flexed power. He believed in structure, yes, but also in humanity. He greeted inmates by name. He asked them how they were doing and meant it. He enforced the rules without making people feel less than human. When he first saw Natalie in the corridor, she was hunched over, arms crossed, eyes locked to the floor. She looked like a ghost. He didn't speak to her directly for days, but he watched. When she skipped meals, he made sure the kitchen staff sent her fruit. When she couldn't sleep, he made sure her unit stayed dark a little longer before morning count. Small things, quiet kindness, nothing noticeable, nothing traceable, but Natalie noticed. The first time he spoke to her, it was barely more than a whisper. She was sitting alone in the common area, staring out the window. He passed by and said, "It gets better, eventually." She didn't reply, but she looked up, and for the first time in days, someone saw her eyes. From there, something began to shift, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually. Dean started checking on her a little more often. Natalie, though still guarded, began to nod when he walked by. Then a thank you, then a full sentence. She didn't trust easily, but Dean didn't ask for trust. He just kept showing up. And somewhere between the silence and the soft glances, something new began to grow, something neither of them had expected, something neither of them would dare admit. Not yet. Dean Holloway wasn't the kind of man people remembered after a first meeting. He didn't bark orders, didn't crack jokes, didn't carry himself like he needed to prove something. He was quiet, steady, and precise, more like the cold gray walls of the prison than the men who worked inside it. And that's exactly how he liked it. He joined the correctional system at 28, after finishing a short stint in the Army and deciding that teaching wasn't for him. He'd always believed he'd settle down, have a couple of kids, a house with a porch, the kind of American dream you see on postcards. But life had a different plan. Dean met Erica during a first aid certification class. She was bold, fast-talking, and striking the kind of woman who could fill a room without trying. They married within a year. For a while, things were good. They bought a house just outside Lexington, planted tomatoes, hosted barbecues. Dean worked nights. Erica taught dance classes at a local studio. They were normal, happy, even. Until the distance crept in. It started with late nights. Then came the locked phone, the unexplained receipts, the coldness in her voice. Dean tried not to question her. He gave space, trusted her. That was his mistake. He found out the truth by accident, a hotel receipt tucked into the back pocket of her jeans. She had been seeing someone else for over a year. Dean didn't yell, didn't cry. He asked one question, "How long?" She answered, "Since last spring." She moved out 3 weeks later. Dean packed her clothes in silence, left them by the door, and went back to work like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. He stopped going out, stopped talking to his coworkers. Every night, he'd come home to an empty house, microwave a frozen dinner, and stare at the TV without hearing a word. His world shrank into something small and predictable. No surprises, no risks, just routine. He wore the same black boots every day, drank the same bitter coffee, and started arriving to work 15 minutes early, not because he wanted to, but because being home felt heavier than being surrounded by inmates. The only thing he allowed himself to carry from his past was a worn leather watch his father had given him before he died. It didn't even tell time properly anymore, but it was something real, something that still ticked when everything else felt like it had stopped. Dean had seen a lot during his 12 years at South Ridge. Women crying, women screaming, women faking illness, injuries, pregnancies. Some tried to flirt, some tried to fight. None of it fazed him. He kept his head down and his file clean. But then came Natalie Quinn. He didn't notice her at first, not really. She was just another intake, another quiet face with hollow eyes. But there was something about the way she moved, like she wasn't used to being in her own skin anymore, like she had been peeled open and left that way. She didn't look around, didn't speak unless spoken to. She ate like the food didn't matter and walked like she had nowhere left to go. Dean heard whispers from other guards. She's the one who attacked her fiancé. Pretty one, but nuts. Won't last long. He ignored the talk. He always did. But he watched her the way he watched all the ones who were breaking quietly. He noticed she didn't sleep much, noticed how she sat alone in the common room, always at the edge, always near the window. She never read, never wrote letters, just stared. When she skipped meals, he had the kitchen send fruit to her cell. When she shook during head count, he adjusted his tone. When the therapist asked if she should be flagged for observation, he said, "Give her time." Not because he had feelings for her, not then, but because something about her pain felt familiar. It took weeks before they exchanged a single sentence. It happened during a late shift. Natalie was sitting in the rec room, alone, curled into herself like she wanted to disappear. Dean was doing rounds, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the room out of habit. As he passed her, he said softly, "It gets better, eventually." She didn't answer, but she looked up. And in that single glance, something shifted. From that moment, their interactions began slow, small, never breaking rules, never calling attention. A nod during lineup, a quiet thank you when he handed her a mail slip, a second longer of eye contact than protocol allowed. Dean didn't recognize what was happening at first. It wasn't desire. It wasn't even attraction. It was recognition. Like two people seeing something broken in each other and understanding it without explanation. Natalie wasn't like the others. She didn't ask for favors, didn't try to charm him. She just existed quietly, painfully, honestly. And Dean, for the first time in years, started to feel something other than numb. He began checking her block more often, timing his patrols so they crossed paths, leaving her the occasional encouraging note under her dinner tray. Nothing dramatic, just words like, "You're stronger than you think," or "One more day." She never said thank you out loud, but she started eating again. Then, one day, she said his name. "Officer Holloway, thanks for not treating me like I'm nothing." He nodded, said nothing, but that night, when he sat in his truck before going home, he stared at the dashboard a little longer than usual. Something was changing. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. It was just another Tuesday, just another cold, gray night at South Ridge. Lights out had come and gone. The prison was quiet. save for the occasional metallic creak of old pipes and the distant hum of the security gates locking down for the night. Dean was on his usual graveyard shift, walking the same dim corridors he had paced for over a decade. Everything felt routine. Until the emergency light on his radio crackled to life. It was the guard posted in Block G, Natalie's block. Inmate Quinn says she's got severe head pain, looks pale, nausea, might be serious. Dean didn't even hesitate. He responded with a sharp, "Copy that," and turned on his heel. Within 2 minutes, he was at cell 18. Natalie was sitting on the edge of her bunk, her hand gripping the side of her head, breathing shallowly. Her eyes were glazed over, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days, which, Dean suspected, was probably true. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't answer, just shook her head slightly. Dean knelt beside her, his voice lower now. "You dizzy, can you stand?" Again, no words, just the faintest nod. He helped her up, gently, and guided her down the corridor toward the infirmary. She leaned into him more than she probably realized. Her skin felt clammy, and every few steps, her knees wobbled. Dean's hand never left her back. When they arrived at the infirmary, the night nurse Shannon was already waiting, a tired woman in her 50s with thick glasses and coffee breath. She glanced at Natalie and sighed. Migraine, most likely. It's been going around. She helped Natalie onto the examination cot, checked her vitals, and gave her a small dose of acetaminophen. She needs to rest. Should be fine in 20 minutes. But before she could finish her sentence, her pager buzzed. Urgent. She looked down, then cursed under her breath. "Shit, they've got a fall in Block E, possible concussion. I need to go now." Dean raised a brow. "You want me to call someone else to watch Quinn?" Shannon was already pulling on her coat. "There's no one else on the floor, and you're cleared. She's sedated. Just keep an eye on her. I'll be back in 20 max." And with that, she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her. And for the first time since they had met, Dean and Natalie were completely alone, no cameras, no noise, no witnesses. The room was dim. Only one overhead light was still on, humming faintly. Natalie lay on the cot, her eyes half closed, breathing slowly. Dean stood near the counter, arms crossed, trying to stay professional, stay focused, stay in control. But then she spoke. "I'm scared," she whispered. He turned, scared of what? She hesitated, then looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "Of leaving." Dean frowned. "You've got what? 4 weeks left." 3.5, she replied. "Everyone thinks I'm counting down, that I should be excited, but I'm not." He stepped a little closer. "Why not?" Her voice cracked. "Because when I walk out of here, I'll be alone again." Dean swallowed, hard. He shouldn't have stepped closer, but he did. Natalie pushed herself up, slowly. "You're the only person who's seen me," and didn't flinch. Dean shook his head. "Don't do this." "I'm not," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I'm just saying goodbye." She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. Their fingers touched, then intertwined. The air in the room shifted from tense to electric. Dean sat beside her on the edge of the cot. "Natalie." She looked at him, eyes full of emotion, but no fear. "I don't want anything from you. I just don't want to feel like a ghost one more night." It wasn't a kiss, not at first. It was a lean, a breath, a shared silence that said everything words couldn't. And then they kissed. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't violent. It was slow, fragile, like both of them were afraid to break something neither could name. Dean's mind screamed at him to stop, but his heart, after years of silence, said otherwise. That night, In a locked infirmary room with no cameras and a woman he wasn't supposed to love, Dean Holloway crossed a line he could never uncross. And Natalie Quinn, 3.5 weeks away from freedom, gave herself to the only person who had treated her like she mattered. It happened only once. But once was all it took. It started 2 weeks later. Natalie had trouble sleeping. Her appetite was gone again. At first, she blamed the stress, the guilt. That night in the infirmary had stayed with her like a hidden scar. She didn't talk to Dean, not directly, but every time she passed him in the corridor, her chest tightened. She could feel his eyes lingering. She could feel her own pulse race. They didn't speak of it, didn't write, didn't touch, but they both knew something had changed, something they couldn't undo. Then came the nausea. It hit hard one morning in the laundry room. The smell of bleach made her dizzy. By the time she got back to her cell, she was doubled over, breathing through clenched teeth. Denise, her cellmate, asked if she needed to go to medical. Natalie waved her off. But when it happened again the next day, and the day after that, she knew. The thought hit her like a freight train. What if I'm pregnant? She tried to dismiss it, tried to reason it away. Maybe it was food poisoning, maybe stress, maybe anything but that. But deep down, she already knew the truth. Natalie waited until late one night, when the lights were out and the unit was quiet, to sneak a request into the infirmary box, a private medical consultation. No symptoms listed, just a date and time. She didn't sleep at all before the appointment. When the nurse took her vitals and asked what was wrong, Natalie just whispered, "I think I might be pregnant." The nurse froze. 30 minutes later, the test confirmed it. Positive. Natalie stared at the result, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. The nurse didn't ask questions, not yet. She just scribbled on a clipboard and said, "We'll need to run a second test in the morning, to be sure." But Natalie was already sure. That night, back in her cell, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her hands over her stomach, her mind spinning. What now? What would happen to Dean? What would happen to her? Could she finish her sentence and get out before anyone found out? Could she hide it for 4 more weeks? She had to try. The next day, Dean found her in the hallway during lunch rotation. He wasn't supposed to speak to her outside protocol, but he saw her face pale, tight-lipped, eyes heavy with something more than exhaustion, and knew. He pulled her aside under the guise of a routine pat-down. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, then down, then nodded once. But her hand brushed against his as she turned away. He knew what that meant. They didn't speak again for a week, but both of them carried the weight in silence. Natalie tried to eat, to act normal, to breathe like everything was fine, but the nausea kept coming. Her skin turned pale, her eyes sunk deeper, and then came the mandatory health check. Every 90 days, all inmates underwent full physical evaluations, blood work, weight, blood pressure, urine tests. It was routine, but this time, it became a trigger for disaster. Natalie tried to fake the test, drank excessive water, tried to swap the cup, anything. But the staff were trained. Procedures were strict. She couldn't cheat the system. 2 days later, she was called into the warden's office. She knew the moment she walked in that they knew. The warden sat stiffly behind his desk. 2 internal affairs officers stood nearby. Natalie sat down without being asked. Her hands shook in her lap. "Miss Quinn," the warden said, his voice flat, "can you explain to us how you came to be pregnant while incarcerated in a secured women-only facility?" She didn't answer. They gave her time. 20 minutes of silence and pressure and repeated questions. Eventually, she broke. Her voice cracked as she said his name, Dean Holloway. The room went still. "What happened?" Natalie looked down. "It only happened once. I was sick. The nurse had to leave. He stayed. We were alone. And it just happened. There was no denial, no accusation, just a simple, exhausted truth. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal. Dean was suspended immediately, escorted from the building in handcuffs. His locker was emptied, his record seized. Every female inmate he had interacted with in the past year was re-interviewed, but no one else had anything to say. No one else had been close to him, only Natalie. He confessed everything, didn't try to defend it, didn't argue consent. He simply told the truth. "It was one mistake," he said, "but I don't regret caring about her." The court didn't care about feelings. Dean was charged with a sexual misconduct with an inmate, a felony offense. He pled guilty. He was sentenced to 2 years in state prison. Natalie, still reeling, was called before the disciplinary board. Her early release was revoked. She was given an additional 6 months on her sentence for violating institutional rules. But then came the appeal. Her lawyer cited her pregnancy, the nonviolent nature of her offense, and her overall behavior record. Under Kentucky's humanitarian parole policy, pregnant inmates could qualify for early release in special circumstances. After a heated review process, the board approved her application. Natalie was released after 3 more months. She walked out of Southridge not with a suitcase, but with a swollen belly, a worn coat, and a quiet promise to the man still sitting behind bars. 3 months after the investigation tore their world apart, Natalie Quinn walked out of prison. There were no cameras waiting, no reporters, no family, just a cold Kentucky morning. Her release paperwork folded in one hand and the other resting gently over her pregnant belly. She was 7.5 months along. Every step she took felt heavy, swollen not just from the child growing inside her, but from the weight of everything she had lost, and everything she was about to face, alone. She had nowhere to go. Her parents hadn't spoken to her since the trial. Her sister lived out of state and barely sent a card. Her old life, her job, her friends, her home had vanished the day the handcuffs clicked shut. All she had now was a tiny apartment arranged by a halfway house, a cheap mattress, a fridge with half a gallon of milk, and the quiet understanding that she would have to rebuild from the ground up. But she didn't complain. She didn't expect comfort. She just focused on one thing, staying healthy for the baby. The hospital staff barely looked her in the eye when she arrived in labor 2 weeks early. No birth partner, no family in the waiting room, just her biting down on a towel during contractions, gripping the side rails, pushing through 12 hours of pain in silence. And then he was born. A boy, 6 pounds, 11 ounces, dark hair, strong lungs, big deep-set eyes that looked just like Dean's. She named him Isaac. No middle name, just Isaac? When they handed him to her, she didn't cry. She just stared at him in disbelief, this small, perfect thing that had come from one broken night, from one impossible connection in the ugliest of places. She held him against her chest and whispered, "You weren't supposed to exist, but I'm so glad you do." Natalie was discharged 2 days later. She wrapped Isaac in a second-hand blanket and carried him back to the apartment she now called home. No crib, no rocking chair, just a drawer lined with towels for a bed, and a kitchen timer she used to remind herself when it was time for the next feeding. She didn't sleep, she didn't eat much, but she never once let him cry alone. Every week, like clockwork, she took a bus across town to visit the state correctional facility where Dean Holloway now served time. She wasn't allowed to touch him, couldn't bring Isaac into the visiting room until he turned 6 weeks old, but once she could, she never missed a single visit. Dean would sit on the other side of the glass, hands pressed to the divider, eyes locked on the tiny bundle in her arms. He never asked how hard it was, never apologized. He just stared at them with a kind of quiet awe, like he couldn't believe they were real. Sometimes they didn't say anything for the first 5 minutes. Sometimes she'd bring little drawings Isaac made, or a picture of him curled up on a blanket. Dean would place his hand on the glass, and Natalie would press the baby's hand to the same spot. They created a ritual, one letter every week, exchanged through approved mail. She wrote about Isaac's first smile, his first night sleeping 5 hours straight, the way he clenched his fists when she bathed him. Dean wrote about how he passed time working in the prison laundry, how he replayed the night over and over, wondering what would have happened if he'd said no. But neither of them said they regretted it. Not once. Natalie took on part-time work as a receptionist at a nonprofit that helped women transition out of prison. The job didn't pay much, but it gave her structure, purpose, a reason to get out of bed on the days she felt like collapsing. People stared. People whispered. She knew what the public thought of her, the inmate who got pregnant by a guard, the woman who ruined a man's life. But Natalie didn't waste energy explaining herself. She had a child to raise, a man to wait for, a life to reclaim. On Isaac's first birthday, she brought a cupcake in a plastic bag and held it up to the visiting glass. Dean smiled, eyes watering, as Isaac clapped his hands and squealed. "That's your boy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's perfect, just like you said he'd be." Dean nodded, wiping his eye. "You're doing better than I ever could have hoped." "I'm just surviving," she replied. "You're doing more than that," he said. That was the thing about their love. It wasn't loud. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There were no candlelit dinners, no surprise gifts, no kisses under rain. What they had was made of survival, of tiny gestures, of persistence in the face of judgment and silence and shame. They had made a mistake, one that cost them everything. But in the space left behind, they were building something else. Something real. Something worth waiting for. The morning Dean Holloway was released, the sky was overcast pale gray, heavy with clouds, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or just hang there like a warning. It had been 2 years since he last stepped outside the gates of South Ridge Correctional, 2 years since the cuffs clicked around his own wrists instead of someone else's. He didn't sleep the night before. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the shuffle of other inmates snoring, coughing, turning over. He thought about everything, about how it started, about the single choice that changed his life, about the boy he'd never held but knew by heart, and mostly about her. He was released just after 7 a.m. No ceremony, no farewell, just a guard walking him to the outer gate, a manila envelope with his belongings, and a nod that said, "You're someone else's problem now." Dean stepped through the gates with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and air that felt too big in his lungs. He looked up, blinking against the light. Then he saw her. Natalie was standing by the parking lot, wearing a dark blue coat and holding a little boy in her arms. "Isaac." The moment Dean saw them, he froze. Part of him didn't believe it. Part of him thought he'd imagined this moment so many times that now his mind was playing tricks. But it was real. Natalie smiled. It wasn't wide or showy, just a soft, tired smile full of something deeper than words. She walked toward him slowly, cautiously, like maybe she was scared he'd disappear again. When they stood face to face, Dean looked at the boy first. Isaac had grown, nearly 2 years old now. Curly dark hair, wide, curious eyes. He was chewing on a plastic ring and clinging to Natalie's scarf. "Hey there," Dean said softly. Isaac stared at him for a beat, then reached out a hand. Dean broke. He reached out too, letting the boy grab his finger, and in that moment, the past 2 years melted into something bearable. Natalie whispered, "He knows you. I've shown him your photo every day." Dean nodded, unable to speak. They didn't hug, not right away. Too many eyes around, too much still to say. But later, at the county courthouse, they stood side by side in front of a clerk with a nameplate and tired eyes. The ceremony was short, just papers, signatures, and a question asked with the same monotone given to parking tickets. "Do you take this woman?" "I do." "Do you take this man?" "I do." No wedding dress, no suit. Natalie wore the same blue coat. Dean had on a second-hand button-up and jeans. Isaac babbled on the bench nearby, playing with a rubber duck from his diaper bag. When they walked out, husband and wife, no one clapped, no one cheered, but Natalie reached for Dean's hand and held it tightly like she wasn't letting go this time. They didn't throw a party. They drove back to a small rental house on the edge of town, 1 bedroom, a leaky faucet, and walls thin enough to hear the neighbors argue. But it was theirs. Dean unpacked his bag. Natalie made toast. Isaac ran in circles chasing nothing in particular. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't perfect. But it was home. That night, when Isaac was asleep and the lights were low, Dean sat beside Natalie on the couch. They didn't talk for a long time. Just sat there in the kind of silence that only people who've been through hell can share without discomfort. Then Dean said, "You shouldn't have waited for me." Natalie looked at him, "But I did. I'm not the man I used to be." She nodded. "Neither am I." They didn't need to say more. Because this wasn't a fairy tale. It was something harder, something earned. They had broken the rules, lost everything, paid the price. But they had found each other, and somehow they still had a future. There were no welcome banners, no happily ever after music, just dishes in the sink, bills on the counter, and the sound of Isaac waking up at 2 a.m. with a fever. That was the reality of their life, now messy, raw, and real. Natalie and Dean had nothing handed to them. No second chances from the world, no warm embrace from a community that had long since turned its back. He couldn't get a job anywhere near law enforcement. She couldn't mention where she met her husband without people raising their eyebrows. Even neighbors kept their distance. Whispers followed them in grocery stores. Parents pulled their children away from the park bench where Natalie sat with Isaac. People didn't forget scandals, especially not ones that started in prison. But inside their small home, something stronger than shame lived, something built brick by brick, hour by hour. Dean took a job at a construction supply warehouse. The pay was lousy, but it was steady. He worked early shifts so he could be home in the afternoon, just in time to scoop Isaac up and kiss his forehead. Natalie continued her work at the nonprofit, helping formerly incarcerated women, something she was now more passionate about than ever. When she spoke to new clients, she didn't mention her own story. She didn't have to. They could see it in her eyes she had survived something. Isaac turned 3 and learned how to say daddy without hesitation. He thought his parents had met in a hospital, and for now, that was good enough. He didn't know that his father had once guarded his mother, that the state had once tried to keep them apart. All he knew was that daddy made the best pancakes, and mommy told the best bedtime stories. And their tiny living room floor was the perfect place to build rocket ships out of cardboard boxes. They didn't have much, but they had each other. Every once in a while, when the house was quiet, Natalie would catch Dean staring out the window, lost in thought. She knew what haunted him, not the arrest, not the trial, not even the prison time. What haunted him most was the fear that maybe he had ruined her life. And every time she saw that look in his eyes, she would take his hand and say, "You didn't save me, Dean. I saved myself, but you reminded me that I was worth saving." Sometimes love doesn't come with flowers or first kisses under fireworks. Sometimes it shows up in places no one dares to look, in locked rooms, in shared silences, in mistakes that turn into miracles. Natalie never glamorized what happened. She never pretended they hadn't crossed a line. They had, and they paid for it. But she also knew that what came after was real and rare and worth it. Years later, when Isaac was old enough to ask, they told him the truth. Not all at once, not with every messy detail, but enough for him to understand that sometimes love grows in impossible places. and that people make mistakes, big ones, but that doesn't mean they don't deserve happiness. They framed a photo on the living room wall, not of their wedding, not of the day Dean was released, but of the three of them in the backyard, Isaac in Dean's arms, Natalie laughing mid-sentence, the wind catching her hair, just a moment ordinary, blurry, perfect. A family that shouldn't have existed. And yet, there they were. Together.